How did Britain trust women to keep the nation running during the Second World War, then just a few years later try to push them back into polishing, cooking and obedience? During the Second World War, Britain trusted women with some of the most vital work in the country. They drove buses and fire engines, they built aircraft and handled machinery, they worked as mechanics, engineers, factory hands, farm workers, plotters, drivers and technicians. Jobs that peacetime Britain had long treated as too dirty, too skilled, too strenuous, or simply too male. And yet, only a few years later, the image being sold across Britain looked very different. Now the ideal woman was back in the home, polishing, cooking, shopping, serving, smiling. The competent wartime worker seemed to dissolve into the cheerful 1950s housewife. So what happened? Did Britain really trust women with the machinery of national survival in the 1940s, only to decide in the 1950s that their proper place was once again the sink, the cooker and the ironing board? In one sense, yes. But the real answer is even more revealing than that, because the war did not transform Britain into an equal society. It simply forced Britain to suspend some of its old assumptions for as long as survival required it. Before the war, many jobs were still strongly divided by sex. Women worked, of course, but often in what were seen as women's jobs: domestic service, shop work, clerical work, textiles, nursing, cleaning. Married women in particular faced strong social and economic pressure to stay out of full-time paid employment. Then total war arrived. Millions of men were taken into the armed forces. Industry had to expand. Aircraft had to be built. Munitions had to be made. Food had to be produced. Transport had to keep moving. Britain suddenly had a brutal problem. It needed more labour than the existing male workforce could provide. So the state turned to women. From 1941, women were called up for war work. At first, this applied to single women aged 20 to 30, but the net widened rapidly. By mid-1943, almost 90% of single women and 80% of married women were working in factories, on the land, or in the armed forces. That figure alone tells you something important. Britain did not suddenly discover that women were capable. Britain discovered it could no longer afford to pretend otherwise. And once women entered these roles, they did not merely fill empty space, they proved they could do the work. Women served as mechanics and engineers, they worked in munitions and aircraft production, they drove buses and fire engines. They joined the Women's Auxiliary Air Force, the Auxiliary Territorial Service, and the Women's Royal Naval Service, better known as the Wrens. They laboured on farms as land girls in harsh conditions to keep the country fed. This was not symbolic work, nor was this just a bit of patriotic theatre. This was heavy, technical, dirty, disciplined, necessary labour. And it was done under pressure, under rationing, under blackout, under bombing, under the knowledge that failure carried national consequences. That is what makes the post-war shift so striking. Because after the war, nobody could honestly claim that women had not shown themselves capable of doing these jobs. The evidence had been there in full public view. The machines ran, the factories produced, the harvest came in, the transport moved, the war effort held. So when women were later nudged, pushed, and culturally herded back toward domesticity, it was not because their competence had been disproven. It was because competence was never the real barrier. But here is the part that often gets missed. Even in wartime, the invitation into male-dominated work came with conditions. Women were trusted, yes, but often as an emergency measure. The language around women's war work was frequently patriotic, temporary and dutiful. This was framed as service to the nation, a sacrifice, a necessity, a filling in. Not always a lasting claim to equality. Even pay reflected that limit. Women commonly received less than men for comparable work. So while war opened doors, it did not necessarily change who owned the building. Women entered these occupations in huge numbers, but the deeper assumptions about status, pay, authority, and permanence were often left intact. That matters, because it helps explain why the post-war retreat could happen so quickly. And this is where the story becomes more unsettling. Because what happened after 1945 suggests that the biggest obstacle was never whether women could do the work. It was whether Britain wanted that fact to reshape society. The really revealing part: why a country that had just watched women keep the war machine running began selling the fantasy that their true fulfillment lay in polishing sideboards and choosing curtains. When the war ended, Britain was exhausted. Men returned from the armed forces and needed jobs. Families wanted stability. The country wanted reconstruction, order, and some sense of normal life after years of upheaval. And in that atmosphere, the old ideal of the male breadwinner regained force. This was not just private prejudice in millions of households, it was structural. Employers often assumed returning men should take priority. Public culture leaned heavily toward family restoration. The home was recast as the centre of recovery, and women's wartime labour, though praised, was often treated as exceptional rather than permanent. So in peacetime the message changed. The heroic female mechanic gave way to the good wife. The uniform gave way to the apron. The factory floor gave way to the kitchen floor. Not because women had become less able, but because Britain no longer needed their labour in quite the same emergency way. And many institutions were more comfortable restoring older hierarchies than dismantling them. The 1950s domestic ideal was powerful. It appeared in advertising, magazines, social expectations, and popular memory. The clean home, the contented mother, the efficient wife, the woman whose skill was now channeled into consumption, housekeeping, and child-rearing. But this image can also be misleading if we treat it as the whole truth, because the 1950s housewife was to some extent an idealised cultural image rather than a complete description of women's lives. Because the story is not that British women all went obediently home and stayed there. Many continued to work, many needed to work. And in the decades after the war, married women's employment began rising again. So the real post-war pattern was not total reversal. It was narrower, subtler, and in some ways more telling than that. Women were not pushed entirely out of work. They were pushed away from many of the prestigious, physical, technical, male-coded jobs that wartime had briefly opened. That is the point. What the Second World War exposed very clearly was that gender roles were far more flexible than peacetime Britain had claimed. If women could maintain transport, handle tools, work machinery, staff anti-aircraft operations, and keep industry running during national emergency, then the old argument that they were naturally unsuited to such work looked very weak indeed. But wartime necessity is not the same as social permission. A nation under existential pressure will tolerate rapid change. A nation rebuilding itself often retreats into familiar hierarchies, and that is exactly what makes this period so revealing. The war proved women's capability. Peace revealed society's reluctance to accept what that proof meant. The emergency temporarily overruled convention. Once the emergency ended, convention fought back. And perhaps that is the most important lesson here. The barrier was never simply whether women could do the work. They had already done it, under pressure, under danger, at national scale. The real question was whether Britain was willing to let that reality permanently change who held power, status, and economic independence. In wartime, necessity said yes. In peacetime, society hesitated. And in that hesitation, the polished fiction of the 1950s housewife was born, not because women had failed the test, but because they had passed it too clearly to be comfortably ignored. And that is what makes this period so revealing. The war proved women's capability. Peace revealed society's reluctance to accept what that proof meant. Because the 1950s British housewife is now one of the most famous stereotypes in modern history. The apron, the cooker, the polished smile, the woman at home. It is such a familiar image that it can feel almost natural. And yet, just a few years earlier, Britain had entrusted those same women with the hard, technical, physical work of keeping the country running. That is the irony at the heart of it. One of the most famous images of British womanhood came immediately after a period that had proved women were capable of far more than the stereotype allowed. So perhaps the real lesson is not that women changed. It is that Britain's expectations changed when the emergency was over. The 1950s housewife was not simply tradition continuing as normal. It was a society quietly retreating from what the war had laid bare. That the old limits placed on women had never been as fixed or as natural as peacetime Britain liked to pretend. Over to you. Did the war leave any lasting change in Britain's view of women? Or was that soon eclipsed by the idealised 1950s housewife? And how far do you think we've really progressed since then? Please share your views in the comments below.